Welcome, APUSH students. How's it going today? What we're going to be doing is looking at Period 5 review. I like to break this period up into two different sections. The first section being the antebellum America. Typically, it's the 1840s. Usually, historians will say 1844 to 1861, which will be the start of the Civil War. The second part, which we'll do in next lecture, will be from Civil War through Reconstruction. So basically 1860 through 1877, with that compromise of 1877 typically being that moniker that ends the Reconstruction period. So let's get started right away with this. In this period of time, first of all, know that this is called the antebellum period. AP loves to see that you're using those terminologies correctly and able to grasp that and utilize that on your essays. Big picture ideas. There's a lot of really big picture ideas that you want to really focus on when you do your writing, especially your LEQs and then your DBQs. The biggest one is sectionalism. Sectionalism is a really huge ideology that has been going around in America from the start of the country. America was very diverse when it comes to the different regions that we had, with the North and South developing very differently throughout the course of time. And these differences, the cultural, the political, the economic, and other differences also will really start taking root within the early confines of American nation in the early 1800s, late 1700s, and will slowly build up to the Civil War. So sectionalism didn't all of a sudden just start in 1844. It was already happening. And the issues of sectionalism will really erupt in the 1840s, really after 1850 is the big turning point will be the Compromise of 1850 to really make sectionalism a national issue that brings us to the brink of war several times. You also have manifest destiny. Again, manifest destiny was not a new concept. It was actually something that was coined back in the 1830s. The ideology was already rooted, even with the Louisiana Purchase and the early aspects of moving west with the Proclamation Act and America's moving westward, right after the French-Indian War. But it's something that will be an absolute overarching theme within this antebellum period, mostly because we have huge amount of territorial gain in this time period, with the Mexican-American War granting us this huge tracts of the Southwest with the Mexican secession. We have the Republic of Texas becoming annexed into America, and we also have the Oregon Territory being a treaty being brokered between America and England to give us those huge areas of land that now will come under the issues of slavery. Will we allow slavery in this new territory in the west of America? Third thing is the political discourse that happens in this time period. We have several parties that will rise and fall, and some parties that will going to continue. Our two national parties today both really got their strength in this time period. The Democrats were already around in the 1820s with the Jacksonian Democrats, and they'll develop into that national party. The Whigs will also be developed in the Jacksonian time period and will also be that secondary party to combat the Democrats' ideology. With those two parties, we also have the rise of the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party being no slavery within the territories. We have the Liberty Party, which basically is an abolitionist party. We have the American Party, or the Know Nothings, that is a one-platform party based on nativism. And then we see the rise of the Republicans once those Whigs basically disband after the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. And so we see this new party come up as a very regional party, a northern party. At the time period, again, no southern state would ever vote for a Republican in those first two elections of 1856 and 1860. The last big idea is this whole aspect of compromises, and really the failed compromises and the failed ability for Congress and representatives to truly make a dent with decreasing the tension between these two different areas, the North and the South. Again, to some extent, the West also. Again, the biggest one being the Compromise of 1850, which was supposed to go down as the end of all compromises. What it was really just a short-lived reduction of tension that will eventually erupt into war within 10 years. So those are the big ideas. Also in this time period, the College Board really plays off of politics. So it's really important to know your presidents and the political parties that they're part of. So you want to know the Whigs, you want to know the Democrats, the Republicans, and then those three lesser known parties, the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party, and like we said, the American Party. The president's time period are Tyler, which will be that Whig that sort of turns back to the Democrats. It'll be the dark horse candidate with Polk, Zachary Taylor, who only lives for 2.5 years. His replacement, Millard Fillmore, which will also be the leader of the American Party during the one election that will run in 1856. Then two really sort of nondescript and failed presidents, Pierce and Buchanan, both Northern Democrats, and both really have a very bad record about reducing tensions. They were the presidents in the 1850s that allowed the sectional tensions to really erupt. So that's really important to note that these presidents were very weak. They were very sort of just toting the Democratic line and really not doing anything to ease tensions, and in some cases, like Buchanan, doing things to heighten tensions when he supported the Lecompton Constitution and also when he supported Roger Taney's decision to Dred Scott, both areas that really sort of fractured the Democratic Party. And then, of course, Lincoln, he will be very short-lived in this time period because basically his election will erupt into a full-blown secession and eventual civil war. To contextualize this period, again, of course, you have to look at the essay prompt to really get into what contextualization would be. But here's some big ideas. First thing is slavery. Slavery, and the issues over slavery are going to dominate contextualization in most essay prompts. So you could talk about the cotton gin or Eli Whitney and the rise of those, giving the need for more Western land to put into cultivation for cotton. You could talk about the economic differences between industrial North and the plantation societies of the South, with the slavery issue being a big divide here. Both societies relying on slaves in this very sort of like a perverse relationship that they have with each other. You can also talk about the Missouri Compromise and this compromise of the 36-30 line, basically being that line of demarcation between northern free states and southern slave states. You can talk about the gag rule that happened in the 1830s to the 1840s. And what that was they basically a stoppage of any anti-slavery propaganda or messaging or petitions in Congress. We'll skip down a couple. We can also talk about the Three-Fifths Compromise as a constitutional point that actually shows that the Constitution was willing and allowed slavery because of their stance on slavery's being 3/5 of a person. I love the Northwest Ordinances because what Jefferson did when he wrote those was he created these 3 to 5 territories in the North, but he also included a banning of slavery north of the Ohio River. So that sort of starts the north-south divide between slavery going forward in those Western territories. So I love the Northwest Ordinances in connection to contextualization here. You could also talk about that slavery wasn't the only thing that was driving these two societies apart. There was a lot of economic issues and a lot of political issues as well as the issue of slavery. You can talk about the states' rights doctrines of southern states wanting the states' rights and the rights of states to sort of be separate from the North, and northern ideology, northern economies. And that really erupts in the tariff and nullification in the 1830s under John C. Calhoun and South Carolina. So those are some big ideas for contextualization. 2 ideas for synthesis. Again, this is not a required thing for the DBQ anymore, but this is something, a way you can get your complex understanding point in that last paragraph. You can always compare this time period to another time period or another point of time within this frame. So one easy way to do it is looking at the Revolutionary War and the 15 years that lead up to it, and the amount of tension that builds between the revolutionaries, the colonies, and the British. You could also maybe pinpoint the comparison of elections of 1860 and the election of 1860 and the election of 1912, and how the breakdown of a party, with the Democrats breaking down the election of 1860 and splitting, will eventually give rise to a very unpopular president when it comes to a popular vote, that is. Only 40% gained Lincoln the victory, or the election of 1912 that he had basically two Republican candidates with Taft and Roosevelt vying for this election, giving rise to, again, a very unpopular president, Woodrow Wilson, when it comes to popular vote-wise, only 42% of the vote that he got. There's a way to contextual or synthesize that you could. Okay, so now let's get into the main parts of the lecture. Something to look about prior to this point is what was going on in the South and the North prior to this time period. So again, you need to look at the past to understand this period itself. So we can definitely look at how the North had a abolition spirit to it. Even though they were the minority in the North, they still were a dominating vocal factor. Again, most Northerners were not very concerned with expansion of slavery. Most Northerners were not abolitionists themselves. Most Northerners really were nondescript when their feelings of slavery at all. But they were dominated in regards to their messaging. William Lloyd Garrison was probably the most pronounced and rhetoric-based. He wrote The Liberator in 1831, and that is basically a periodical would come out and would spread his abolitionist ideologies. He wanted a complete, immediate, and uncompensated emancipation of slaves, so very extreme. You had also writing for him was Frederick Douglass. He also wrote the North Star, which was his own based abolitionist newspaper. You had Harry Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852 in combativeness of the Compromise in 1850 and the increased fugitive slave law. You have Harriet Tubman and other Underground Railroadists who would help basically get escaped slaves to the North. Even though it didn't really free that many slaves overall, it was just this conspiracy that the Southerners thought that all Northerners were out to get slaves to the North and give them the help they needed to gain freedom. And you also had some slave revolts and ideologies that all failed, but it started to get more tension to be created in this time period right before the antebellum period and the period 5. You have David Walker's, and he wrote basically different types of books about the calls for slaves to revolt and stand up for themselves. You have Nat Turner of Virginia, who actually stages a rebellion, and then it fails. You have Denmark Vesey, whose rebellion will fail before it even gets started. And then, of course, you have John Brown's raid to Harper's Ferry, which is in 1859, where he basically wanted to raid the federal arsenal and then gain weapons to then start a slave revolt. Even though the North will convict him and try him and then put him to death, the South thought that the Northerners supported this type of actions and almost viewed him as a martyr, a martyr-esque type of person. Then you also have the Southerners' view of life. They really pushed slaves and African Americans in a very derogatory way. They had minstrel shows, racial stereotypes for African Americans. Of course, you had the gag resolutions that put the ban on slavery. You had states' rights that claimed that states have the right to slaves. But again, the biggest thematic thing is that as the years went on, slave owners in the South, and really all Southerners, started to view slavery as a positive good rather than a necessary evil. So early on in our nation's history, slavery was seen as a bad thing, but a necessary thing because of labor issues. But as we moved on, and as more and more immigrants came to America, slavery really wasn't an economically viable thing that needed to happen. We could have paid slaves and then freed them and become paid laborers. We also could have brought in, Northerners and Irishmen to work those areas in the South, but it was a choice not to at that point. And so they had to defend their institution by treating them slightly better on the plantations, to basically to justify it, by saying that they were giving them religion and leadership and the life ability to help them out to sort of justify the treatment and bondage them into slavery. We also see the economic, demographic, and cultural difference between the North and South here. So economy was really easy. Obviously, industrialized economy, mostly industrial and food crops in the North, with the South being mostly plantation-based, where most Southerners actually don't own slaves. Only about 30% of all Southerners actually own slaves, with most of the slaves being held by very few people with huge plantations, and again, and then the other group being the yeoman farmers owning 1 or 2 slaves, and most Southerners owning none at all. The demographics are obviously a large population in the North, very diverse. Immigrants rushed in, Irish and German in this time period with the biggest wave of immigrants in the North. Again, biggest cities, biggest population clusters in the North. South, low population growth, very little immigration, and very undiverse for the most part. And culture-wise, we see culture-wise abolitionist and minority, but growing in this time period where Southerners, they really wanted to spread their way of life to defend the institution of slavery as a positive good. So even Southerners who did not own slaves accepted slavery as a positive good because it put low economic level whites into a realm of at least not being the bottom of the social totem pole. And the politics of the antebellum period. Of course, you start off with the Whig and Democratic parties, and then also you see the Free Soil and the Liberty parties come up. The Free Soil being no slavery in new territories, the Liberty Party being very much an abolitionist party. You see the American and Know Nothing Party will form over issues of nativism, especially Irish immigration in the East. Eventually, you'll see the Whig Party disband and collapse after the support of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Then, because of that, we'll see the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party, and the Whig Party all sort of join together to form this new regional party, this northern party called the Republicans. And then by the end of this antebellum period, you're going to see the destruction and the splitting of the Democratic Party into 2 different areas, a Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats, which will allow for this only 40% popular vote candidate, Lincoln, to get elected in 1860. And of course, you can't talk about this period without territorial expansion and what that means for sectionalism and division. So, the big term is manifest destiny. John L. Sullivan coined this. Pretty much, it's America's destiny to conquer and civilize the entire continent, basically to push our republican institution, our way of life, all the way Pacific Ocean, not caring about what countries fall in the way, or, more importantly, what peoples, as the Native Americans, fall in this way. And of course, we had a president who was going to be really pushing this. James K. Polk, this dark horse candidate, this Democrat from Tennessee, was very pro-expansion. He promised only to serve 1 term, and he ran against Henry Clay. And this election was pretty close when it comes to popular vote-wise. But as you see, Polk easily won the electoral vote 170 to 105. And this will push forward his agenda of the massive American expansionism. And here's some of the things we expanded. Right after this election, before Tyler leaves office, he will annex Texas officially, gaining this piece of land right there for the American government, obviously becoming a slave state. We see a 54-40-year fight, Polk's message to take all of Oregon. Of course, they'll have a treaty that brokers it out where we take basically the 49th parallel and below for America, and the rest of it goes to British Canada. We see the Mexican-American War net us huge amounts of land in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in the Mexican concession. This whole area right here will be given to America in that secession. Eventually, that little area right down there will be bought for the Southern Railroad line, the Gadsden Purchase. We see lots of debates over this war. We see Henry David Thoreau protest by not paying his tax with civil disobedience. We see the spot resolution where Lincoln, the Whig, says, I want to see the exact spot that American blood was shed on American soil that started this war. Because a lot of Whigs thought this was a war just to gain more expansionism and then thus gain more territory that's open to slavery. The impact of the war is big. We have the Wilmot Proviso. This Wilmot Proviso basically was an attempt by Northern Whigs to create that all new territory within this Mexican secession was going to be closed to slavery. It was obviously rejected by the Senate that had the actual majority because Texas was in, they had more states than the North did at that time. Eventually, because of the gold rush and thousands of people flocking into California, over 100,000 people by 1950 or 1850, we see that California applies for admission as statehood. This will then have a huge issue because this would offset the balance that was already there between a 15-15 split between slave states and free states. In this compromise, California will become a free state, thus upsetting the balance in favor of free states. Number two, popular sovereignty will be in all this Mexican secession territory. That purple area will be open to slavery through popular sovereignty. And the biggest one, three, will be a stricter new fugitive slave law, and this will enrage abolitionists in the North. We'll get to that in a few slides. Also, you will have this Gadsden Purchase that will be purchased right in the very southern part of Arizona to allow for a southern railway route to be looked into. And then we'll see huge amounts of compromise that fails to deal with the sectional tensions that are rising. Obviously, the Compromise of 1850 didn't do that. They thought that, well, that was a thing that will last, that will take care of people. It didn't. The Fugitive Slave Act was a huge problem for Northerners. They initially passed the personal liberty laws that says that local jails will not use for fugitive slaves. They also will have vigilante and vigilance committees that will really protect fugitive slaves from slave catchers. So a lot of Northerners are going to be very much against Southerners coming up and trying to take back escaped slaves, or even in some cases freed black men who already had their freedom. You also have the Kansas-Nebraska Act. These two new territories being opened up from the former Louisiana Purchase territory. It was going to be promoted by Stephen Douglas, a Northern Democrat from Illinois. And in this, these territories would be an issue of slavery will be decided by popular sovereignty, meaning the people of those territories will get to vote and decide if they want slavery within their territories. Thus, it pretty much repeals the Missouri Compromise line, stating that everything below this line right here, the 3630 line, is going to be slavery. Everything above it is going to be free. It sort of voids that out without officially voting it out. And we're going to see a huge opposition in the North. Because of this, and because of the Whigs signing this into law, many Northerners will basically leave the Whig Party, and the Whigs, within 2 years, will disband. They'll run one more election in 1850. I'm sorry, they aren't going to run any more elections. They'll disband in 1854, and then by 1856, there won't even be a party to run for the next election. And eventually, sectionalism, because of Kansas-Nebraska, will erupt in violence, or bleeding Kansas. You'll see pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups rushing into that territory to sway the vote in their favor for if Kansas becomes a slave or a free territory. And again, there's violence on both sides, with the pro-slavery people starting it. Powhatan Creek Massacre is John Brown and the anti-slavery group will kill 5 pro-slavery settlers. Also, 2 rival governments are going to be set up. It's going to be the Topeka government, which is going to be a free soil government, and there's going to be the Lecompton government, which is a pro-slavery government. It's important to note that Buchanan, the president, will eventually support this Lecompton Constitution, which doesn't actually take into effect, but his support is going to be a big reason why the Democratic Party is going to split into 2 northern and southern sections. We also have the Lincoln-Douglas debates in this time period, which doesn't represent violence, but does sort of put the writing on the wall for the election of 1860. You see that Lincoln and then Douglas are both vying for for national senator for Illinois. And Lincoln is going to create his House divided speech, that a house divided upon itself cannot exist. And this puts the writing on the wall that in the election of 1860, when he wins it, then Lincoln will eventually try to take away slavery, even though in his campaign and in his inauguration, he promises not to touch slavery in any state that it currently exists, but only limit slavery going forward in territories. So he states that, but again, the writing was on the wall with this speech right here. Since he wasn't going to have an all-slave nation, well, guess what he was going to probably want to push eventually? An all-free nation. For Douglas, the Freeport Doctrine is going to be his main ideology, which we already know is popular sovereignty, that basically the government cannot stop slavery from existing if the people of the territories want to create constitutions that allow it. Douglas will win the Senate seat, but Lincoln gains national attention that will then catapult him to the election of 1860. Some other sectionalist ideologies is obviously we have the beating of Charles Sumner from Massachusetts by Southerner Preston Brooks in Congress, and that was in 1856, I believe, and maybe 1857. We see the Dred Scott decision, where Dred Scott is slave, basically is suing for his freedom. Roger Taney, a Jackson appointee, basically denies Dred Scott his freedom, and he also says that Dred Scott is a slave, therefore he is property. Pretty much Fifth Amendment, right? Property cannot be taken away from citizens for any reason unless under due process. So Congress can't ban slavery from territories because slaves are property, and by doing that, you're taking away people's property rights. So this also repeals that Missouri Compromise. And what really gets the Democrats into trouble here is Buchanan supports this, which a lot of Northern Democrats did not support. They were fine with slavery where it existed, but they did not want slavery creeping into Northern territories as well. And the election of 1860, you cannot talk about this time period without talking about the election of 1860, because this is that turning point that is the point beyond return, pretty much. Once Lincoln gets elected, all hell breaks loose. But what leads up to that is huge amounts of tension. The Democrats splitting into a Northern and Southern grouping. Also a third party running, the Constitutional Union under Bell. So you see the Stephen Douglas are the Northern Democrats. You see Breckinridge being the Southern Democrats. And then you see this Constitutional Union party or States' Rights Party that wins a couple states, including Virginia, under President President-elect Bell. Who wins this election with only getting 40% of the popular vote is Lincoln. He gets no Southern support whatsoever, and he gets mostly Northern support, and he wins. And of course, within weeks, South Carolina will leave the Union, and then several other Southern states will also leave the Union in due time, with the Deep South, with Florida and Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama, Louisiana, also leaving the Union. With the border states, sort of not. Then you have the states like Virginia and North Carolina and Kentucky and Missouri and Maryland that are sort of like playing and hanging around and seeing what happens before they make a decision. So here we are. We see Lincoln dominates the North and the West. We see Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, dominate the South. We see Douglas only win a couple states, even though he does get the second most popular vote-wise here. You see Constitutional Union only gets a portion of it, but only gets those areas right there, states' rights, as those big four. Okay, so South Carolina secedes first. These are the fire eaters. The fire eaters are these very die-hard Southern Democrats who are wanting secession. So that happens. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas all leave the Union, form Confederate States of America with Jefferson Davis, this man right here, as their president, with the initial capital being in Montgomery, Alabama. Eventually that capital will move to Virginia once Virginia joins the Confederacy. Excuse me. Buchanan does nothing in this time period, so you can put a lot of blame on this president. He declares the secession illegal, but that the federal government has no ability to restore the Union by force. So this is where he comes in fault, because if you had a stronger president, maybe they would have brought the military in, forced South Carolina, forced these states back into the Union under some compromise. It does not happen. We do see some representatives try to compromise, like John Crittenden from Kentucky. He proposed the Crittenden Plan, which is this line that extends all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and basically, or California actually. And anything below this line, the Missouri line, is going to be slavery going forward. Anything above this line is free states, and there's no popular sovereignty at all. There's no let the states decide. It's all about where the line falls. Eventually, Lincoln will take office in 1861. His inaugural address, he promises to permit slavery in existing states, but he also promises that all territories going forward will become free soil. Secession of confederacies is illegal, and the Union will hold on to all federal property, is what he claims here too, which will set up the first shots of the Civil War, which are Fort Sumter, where basically in April 12th, 1861, Confederate forces of South Carolina will storm and fire upon the Union base and Union fort at Charleston Harbor. Excuse me. The fort will be attacked, it will be taken over, and Lincoln calls for 75,000 state militiamen to put down the insurrection, and thus starting Civil War. Going forward, right after this time period, we see the states of Virginia and North Carolina and Arkansas and other states like that then join the South. We also see some border states, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri and Delaware, slave states that actually stay with the Union. We see 4 slave states stay with the Union, and then we see a few of them that do leave too. And that will take us into our next period, which will be, again, period 5, but also the next part 2, which will be Civil War and Reconstruction. So there you go, AP pushers. You guys have a great day. Study for the AP test. Until next time, good luck. Have a great day. Bye, y'all.